The gravel crunching beneath the tires of my sedan sounded like a countdown I wasn't ready to hear. I put the car in park and killed the engine, but my hands stayed gripped on the leather steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. Beside me, Emily was already unbuckling her seatbelt. A bright, anxious smile plastered on her face as she looked toward the sprawling suburban house that belonged to her parents. To anyone else, the two-story colonial with its manicured lawn and blooming hydrangeas looked like the picture of American domestic bliss. To me, it looked like a fortress where I was the eternal invader. Ready? Emily asked, her hand brushing my arm. As I'll ever be, I lied, forcing a smile that felt tight around the corners. We stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. It was Sunday, the mandatory pilgrimage day. For 5 years, this had been the routine. I would work 60-hour weeks managing high-stakes portfolios, building a life of comfort and stability for us, only to spend my limited free time being treated like a piece of furniture that clashed with the decor in Martha's living room. As we walked up the path, the front door swung open before we even knocked. Martha stood there, wiping her hands on a floral apron, her face lighting up with a theatrical warmth that I knew was exclusively reserved for her blood relatives. "Nelly, my darling," Martha exclaimed, stepping out to engulf my wife in a hug that seemed designed to physically shield her from me. "Hi, Mom," Emily said, melting into the embrace. I stood a few feet back, holding a bottle of expensive wine I had picked out, a vintage Martha claimed to love but never remembered I bought. When they finally separated, Martha's gaze flickered to me. The temperature in her eyes dropped 10 degrees. "Hello, David," she said, the greeting clipped and perfunctory. She didn't move to hug me or even shake my hand. "Hi, Martha. You're looking well," I said, extending the bottle. "Picked this up for dinner." She took the bottle by the neck, barely glancing at the label. "Oh, we're actually having iced tea, but I suppose I can put this in the cellar." "Come in, don't let the bugs in." She turned on her heel, leaving me to catch the screen door before it slammed. Inside, the house smelled of roast chicken and lemon polish, a scent that should have been comforting, but instead triggered a knot of tension in my stomach. In the living room, Emily's younger sister Sarah was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up until Emily entered. Sarah squealed, jumping up. They hugged like they hadn't seen each other in years, though we had just had lunch with Sarah 3 days ago, a lunch I had paid for. When Sarah finally acknowledged me, it was with a smirk that bordered on a sneer. "Hey David, nice watch. Bonus season must be treating you well." "It's doing all right, Sarah," I replied evenly, ignoring the jab. "Good to see you." "Yeah, well, someone has to keep the economy going while the rest of us struggle to find our artistic muse," she quipped, dropping back onto the sofa. Sarah had been finding her muse as a freelance graphic designer for 4 years, which mostly involved complaining about clients she didn't have and asking Emily for loans that never came back. The afternoon wore on with the agonizing slowness of a root canal. I sat in the armchair in the corner, the one with the stiff back that nobody else wanted, sipping a glass of water while the 3 women chattered rapidly about people I didn't know and memories from before I existed in their world. Every time I tried to interject, to share a relevant anecdote or just agree with a point, the conversation would stall for a split second, acknowledge my sound, and then divert around me like a stream around a stone. "Oh, the lighting is perfect right now," Sarah announced suddenly, jumping up and grabbing her phone. "Mom, get together by the fireplace. We need a new shot for Mom's birthday post next week," Martha preened, patting her hair. "Oh, stop it. I look a mess." "You look gorgeous, Mom." "Come on," Emily said, pulling her mother close. They arranged themselves in front of the hearth, a tableau of smiling, blonde women. I stood up instinctively, smoothing my shirt, ready to step into the frame as I usually did before being shuffled to the edge. "David," Sarah said, extending her hand with the phone in it. "Do you mind? You have longer arms." "You can get the best angle." I froze. My hand hovered halfway to my tie. "You want me to take it?" "Well, yeah," Martha chimed in, fixing her smile for the lens. It's a mother-daughter thing, David. Just family for this one. Asterisk, just family. Asterisk. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. 5 years. A marriage certificate. A mortgage I largely paid for. None of it qualified me as family. I took the phone. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Sure, squeeze in. I snapped 3 photos. In the viewfinder they looked happy, complete. A closed circle. I handed the phone back to Sarah, who barely mumbled a thanks before zooming in to check her own expression. Perfect, Sarah declared. I'll crop it and post it later. Dinner's ready, Martha announced, clapping her hands. We moved to the dining room. The table was set beautifully, but as usual, the seating arrangement was telling. Martha at the head, Sarah and Emily on either side of her, facing each other. I was placed at the far end, opposite Martha, a vast expanse of roast chicken and untouched silverware between us. The conversation during the meal revolved around cousin Jenny's wedding, a neighbor's divorce, and Sarah's desire to move into a loft downtown. I ate silently, the food tasting like ash. I watched Emily, waiting for her to catch my eye, to offer a sympathetic wink, but she was too embroiled in her mother's stories. Then, the shift happened. I knew it was coming. I had developed a sixth sense for it. Martha cleared her throat, her demeanor shifting from dismissive to tragically burdened. She set her fork down with a heavy sigh. Is everything okay, Mom? Emily asked immediately, the dutiful daughter. Oh, it's nothing to worry you girls with, Martha said, waving a hand dramatically. It's just ... The contractor came by yesterday to look at the roof. The leak in the guest bedroom is worse than we thought. He says the whole section needs replacing. That sounds expensive, Sarah said through a mouthful of potatoes. It is, Martha said, her eyes finally locking onto mine down the length of the table. The coldness was gone, replaced by a predatory expectation. It's about $8,000. With your father's pension being what it is, and the medical bills from last winter. Well, I just don't know where we're going to find that kind of money on such short notice. Silence descended on the table. Emily bit her lip, looking down at her plate. She knew their finances were a mess, mostly due to mismanagement and Sarah's indulgences, but she couldn't bear to see her mother stressed. Sarah looked at me, her eyebrows raised. Well, David, you just got that big promotion, right? The audacity was breathtaking. 10 minutes ago, I wasn't family enough to be in a photo. Now, I was the patriarch expected to open the checkbook. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, taking my time. That is a difficult situation, Martha. Roof repairs are never cheap. No, they aren't, Martha said, her voice dropping to a whisper. We wouldn't ask if it weren't an emergency. We're family after all. We help each other. Asterisk, we help each other. Asterisk, I almost laughed out loud. Emily and I are saving for a down payment on a larger place, Martha, I said carefully. Our liquidity is a bit tied up right now. Martha's face hardened instantly. Oh, I see. I didn't realize a bigger house for yourselves was more important than a roof over your mother-in-law said. I suppose that's the finance world for you. Numbers over people. Emily looked up, panic in her eyes. David, maybe we can look at the budget? Just see if there's wiggle room? I looked at my wife. She wasn't malicious, just conditioned. She had spent her life pleasing Martha, and she expected me to do the same. But looking at Martha's expectant, entitled face and Sarah's smug expression, something inside me felt heavy and exhausted. I was the golden goose, but I wasn't allowed in the coop. I'll look at the numbers, Emily, I said, my voice flat. Thank you, David, Martha said, picking up her fork and immediately returning to her cheerful demeanor, the transaction complete. Now, Sarah, tell me more about this loft you Shallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It sounds divine. I sat back in my chair, listening to the hum of their voices, feeling the solitude wrap around me like a cold blanket. I was the bank, the driver, the audience, but never the sun. And as I watched them, a singular terrifying thought took root in my mind. Asterisk, I don't think I can do this for another 5 years. Asterisk. The notification on my phone screen glowed with a deceptively innocent light, a digital summons that felt less like a request for company and more like a subpoena. Martha, my mother-in-law, who usually treated my presence at family gatherings with the same enthusiasm one reserves for a mild toothache, had sent a text. It wasn't just a text, it was an invitation. A formal, specifically worded invitation to celebrate her 60th birthday at Le Jardin d'Or *, the city's most pretentious and exorbitantly priced French fusion restaurant. My suspicions flared instantly, hot and bright. For years, I had been systematically maneuvered to the periphery of the family dynamic. I was the necessary accessory to Emily, tolerated but never embraced. Holidays were usually potlucks where my contribution was criticized, or casual backyard affairs where I was left to man the grill while the real family conversed inside. A dinner at a place where the appetizers cost more than a weekly grocery run? That didn't fit the pattern. It broke the established algorithm of their disdain. It's a trap, I said, tossing the phone onto the sofa cushion. She wants something. Emily, sweet, optimistic Emily, looked up from her book, her eyes wide with that perpetual hope that her family would finally function like the ones on television. She picked up the phone, reading the message with a soft smile that made my chest ache. Oh, come on, she pleaded, her voice a soothing balm I desperately wanted to believe. It's a milestone birthday. Maybe she's turning over a new leaf. Maybe she realizes that 60 is too old to hold grudges or play favorites. Please, for me? It would mean so much to have everyone together without any fighting. I looked at her, really looked at her. Shallallahu alayhi wasallam, the fatigue of being the peacekeeper. The bridge between a husband who Shallallahu alayhi wasallam threw the charade and a mother who built the stage. I couldn't deny her. Fine, I sighed, the word heavy with resignation. But if she makes one comment about my job or my background, we're leaving. She won't, Emily promised, kissing my cheek. She just wants to celebrate. We arrived at Le Jardin d'Or precisely at 7. The restaurant was a temple of excess, dripping with crystal chandeliers and draped in velvet so heavy it looked like it could smother sound itself. The air smelled of truffle oil and old money. The valet looked at my sedan with a sneer that suggested I had parked a tractor in the lobby, but I tossed him the keys and steeled myself for the performance inside. We found them at a large, circular table near the back, the prime spot for observing the room while remaining conspicuously separate. Martha was holding court, flanked by her other daughter, Sarah, and a smattering of cousins who usually only materialized when there was free alcohol. There they are! Martha cried out as we approached. She didn't stand up, but she extended a hand adorned with rings that looked heavy enough to sink a small boat. I was worried you'd gotten lost. Happy birthday, Martha, I said, keeping my tone neutral. So glad you could make it, Sarah chimed in, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She shifted her chair, barely making room for me. We were just looking at the wine list. It's impressive. I sat down, and immediately the dynamic shifted. It wasn't the hostile freeze-out I was used to. It was something warmer, stickier. It was the way a spider welcomes a fly. The waiter, a man with a mustache so sharp it could cut glass, materialized with leather-bound menus. Water for the table? He asked. Sparkling, Martha said instantly, waving a hand. And let's start with 3 bottles of the Chateau Margaux, the 2015. I stiffened. I knew enough about wine to know that she had just ordered a down payment on a car in fermented grape form. I glanced at Emily, who was studying her menu intently, perhaps trying to make herself invisible. Are we expecting more people? I asked, trying to keep the incredulity out of my voice. 3 bottles is quite a bit for a start. Martha laughed, a tinkling artificial sound. Oh, don't be such a bore. It's a celebration. Besides, Cousin Greg is thirsty, aren't you, Greg? Greg, a man in his 30s who still wore his college fraternity ring, grunted in affirmation. The ordering process that followed was a masterclass in gluttony. Usually when someone else is treating, or even when the bill is being split, there is a social contract, a subtle dance of restraint. You don't order the market-price seafood tower unless the host insists. You don't ask for the truffles to be shaved onto your pasta unless you are prepared to pay for the privilege. Tonight, however, the social contract had been shredded and used for confetti. "I'll have the Wagyu ribeye," Martha announced, snapping the menu shut. "Rare. And add the lobster tail." "The large one." "Excellent choice, madame," the waiter purred. "I'll take the seared scallops to start, followed by the rack of lamb," Sarah said, tapping her fingernails on the tablecloth. "And let's get a few orders of the caviar service for the table. To share." The cousins followed suit, emboldened by the matriarch's lead. It was a cascade of excess: foie gras, imported oysters, aged steaks, sides that cost more than entrees at a normal establishment. They ordered with a voracious speed, barely looking at the descriptions, certainly not looking at the prices. I sat there, my menu unopened, watching the scene unfold with a growing pit in my stomach. It wasn't just the money. I could afford the dinner, technically. It was the presumption. It was the absolute unwavering certainty in their eyes that they were not paying for this. There had been no discussion of my treat. I hadn't offered to host. The invitation had been from Martha. Etiquette dictated that the host pays, or at least, that the bill is discussed beforehand. But looking around the table, I shalallahu alayhi wasallam the truth in their body language. Martha was leaning back, relaxed, regal. Sarah was already posting a photo of the wine bottle on Instagram. They weren't checking their wallets. They weren't mentally tallying the cost. They were looking at me. It was subtle at first, a glance here, a nod there. But as the waiter turned to me, the silence at the table grew heavy and expectant. "And for you, monsieur?" the waiter asked. I looked at Martha. She was beaming at me, her expression a toxic mix of challenge and feigned affection. "Order whatever you like," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness. "We want everyone to be happy tonight." The "we" hung in the air. It was a royal "we." It implied that she was the benevolent queen granting permission, while I was the treasurer expected to open the coffers. I looked at Emily. She had lowered her menu, her face pale. She had done the math. She shalallahu alayhi wasallam the 3 bottles of vintage wine, the Wagyu, the caviar. She shalallahu alayhi wasallam the trap just as the steel jaws were slamming shut. Her eyes met mine, pleading, apologetic, terrified of the scene that would ensue if I refused, but equally horrified by the blatant exploitation. "Emily," I said softly. "I'll just have the garden salad and the chicken," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Nonsense." Martha cried, reaching over to pat Emily's hand. "It's a party." "Have the lobster, darling." "You love lobster." She turned to me, her eyes hardening to flint. "Emily rarely gets to enjoy the finer things. You wouldn't deny her that, would you?" The manipulation was breathtaking. She was using my wife as a human shield for her own greed. If I objected to the cost now, I wasn't just being cheap. I was denying Emily happiness. I was ruining the birthday. I was the villain. My grip tightened on the heavy linen napkin in my lap. The waiter hovered, pen poised. The table watched, the cousins grinning like hyenas waiting for the kill. They didn't just want a free meal, they wanted a show of submission. They wanted me to bow down, pull out the credit card, and thank them for the privilege of being robbed. I took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of expensive wine and deceit. "I'll have the soup," I said calmly to the waiter, not breaking eye contact with Martha. "And tap water for me." The smile faltered on Martha's face. "Just soup?" "But we're celebrating." "I'm not very hungry," I lied, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "But please enjoy your Wagyu." The first bottle of wine was poured. Martha raised her glass. "To family," she toasted, her eyes locking onto mine with a predatory gleam. "To family," the cousins echoed. I didn't raise my water glass. I sat there, surrounded by the clatter of silverware and the performative laughter of people who despised me, knowing that when the check came, the war would truly begin. But for now, I watched them gorge themselves, each bite a tally mark on a bill they had no intention of paying, and I felt a cold, hard resolve settling in my chest. The ambush was successful, but the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Mater D navigated us through the labyrinth of white linen and crystal glassware, his posture stiff with the kind of professional arrogance reserved for Michelin-starred establishments. The private dining room reserved for the chaotic celebration of Martha's 60th birthday was located at the very back of a glass-walled enclosure that offered a view of the city skyline while muffling the noise of the main floor. It was meant to be an evening of celebration, a peace offering Emily had begged me to agree to, hoping that a milestone birthday might soften her mother's jagged edges. As we approached the oval table, centerpiece heavy with cascading orchids and candles, I instinctively did a head count. There were 8 of us in the party. Martha, her husband George, Emily's 2 siblings and their spouses, Emily and myself. My eyes scanned the high-backed velvet chairs arranged with military precision. 1, 2, 3, 7. I paused, assuming it was a simple oversight by the staff. The hostess, a young woman with a clipboard pressed against her chest, frowned slightly as she checked her list, her eyes darting from the table to our group. Before she could apologize or signal for a busboy to fetch another setting, Martha's voice sliced through the ambient jazz, sharp and sudden. "Oh, don't fuss, dear," Martha said, waving a manicured hand at the hostess, though her eyes were locked onto mine. They glittered with a predatory amusement I had come to know intimately over the last 3 years. "The count is perfectly correct." Emily, who had been unbuttoning her coat, froze. She looked at the table, then at her mother. "Mom, there are 7 chairs. There are 8 of us. Where is he supposed to sit?" Martha offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the corners of her mouth twitching upward in a mockery of warmth. She smoothed the front of her silk dress, taking her time, ensuring the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone but her. "This table is for family," Martha announced loudly. Her voice carried, causing heads to turn at the nearby tables outside the glass. She turned her gaze to me, her expression hardening into something brittle and cold. "And since he isn't blood, and you 2 aren't even married yet, I simply couldn't justify squeezing everyone in. It ruins the aesthetic of the dinner service." She pointed a long-bearinged finger toward the far corner of the room, near the swinging double doors that led to the kitchen. There, shoved against the wall beneath a fire extinguisher, sat a small round bistro table. It was barely large enough for a bread basket, set with a single placemat. It was the kind of table usually reserved for a misbehaving child or overflow seating when a restaurant was illegally over capacity. "I had them set up a special spot for him," Martha continued, her tone dripping with faux generosity. "It's practically a private dining experience. But this main table? This is for the immediate circle. For the legacy." The cruelty of it was so naked, so theatrical, that for a moment, the room seemed to lose its oxygen. Emily's face went from confused to crimson in a heartbeat. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "Are you insane?" Emily's voice shook, loud enough that her father George looked down at his shoes, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "He is my partner. We have lived together for 2 years. You cannot seriously expect him to sit in the corner like a dog while we eat dinner." "I expect him to respect our traditions," Martha snapped, dropping the facade of sweetness. "It is a family birthday. If he wants to be part of this family, he needs to learn his place in the hierarchy. He isn't family yet. Not legally, and certainly not by blood." Emily stepped forward, ready to launch a war she had been suppressing for a decade. I could see the vein in her temple throbbing, the tears of sheer frustration welling in her eyes. She opened her mouth to scream, to likely cancel the dinner and drag me out of there, but I placed a hand gently on her forearm. I recognized the snub. It was the same energy as the Christmas stocking I never received, the family photos where I was asked to hold the camera, the conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. But this was an escalation. This was public, and it was a trap. If Emily caused a scene, Martha would play the victim, crying about her ruined birthday and her hysterical daughter. If I stormed out, I was the rude, ungrateful boyfriend who couldn't handle a simple seating arrangement. "It's fine, Em," I said. My voice was calm, steady, contrasting sharply with the ringing tension in the air. "It is not fine," Emily hissed, looking at me with wild eyes. "Look at where she wants to put you. It's by the kitchen entrance. The waiters will be bumping into you all night." I said it's fine. I gave her arm a reassuring squeeze. Though my insides were churning with a cold, hard rage, I looked at Martha. She was waiting for the explosion, waiting for the drama that would feed her narrative of my unsuitability. I decided not to give her the satisfaction. "I appreciate you including me at all, Martha. The separate table is no problem." Martha blinked, her smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected compliance. She wanted a fight. "Well," Martha sniffed, recovering quickly. "At least one of you has some manners. Sit down, everyone. The appetizers are coming." I walked away from the group. The physical distance felt like crossing a canyon. I could feel the eyes of Emily's siblings on my back, some pitying, some relieved it wasn't them in the crosshairs. I navigated around a waiter carrying a tray of oysters and took my seat at the tiny table. It wobbly, one leg shorter than the others. And every time the kitchen door swung open, a blast of heat and the smell of dish soap washed over me. From my vantage point, I was an observer. I watched them settle in. I Shalallahu alayhi wasallam, the empty space where I should have been, a gap in the circle that felt less like an omission and more like a scar. I Shalallahu alayhi wasallam. Emily sit down, but she didn't scoot her chair in. She sat on the edge, her posture rigid, staring at her mother with a look of absolute loathing. A waiter approached me, looking apologetic. "Sir, can I bring you a drink?" "A double bourbon," I said, not taking my eyes off the main table. Neat. The dinner began in a stilted, awkward fashion. I could hear Martha holding court, her voice shrill as she recounted stories from Emily's childhood, carefully editing them to make herself the hero. Every time the kitchen door swung open, hitting the back of my chair with a soft thud, I took a sip of the bourbon. It burned, grounding me. I wasn't just sitting apart. I was gaining perspective. Seeing them from the outside, stripped of the obligation to participate in the polite fiction of a happy family, I Shalallahu alayhi wasallam, the rot at the center. I Shalallahu alayhi wasallam, George's cowardice, the siblings' subservience, and Martha's tyranny. And I Shalallahu alayhi wasallam, Emily, alone in a crowd, looking at her wine glass as if wishing she could drown in it. The first course arrived. At the main table, plates of truffle risotto were placed with a flourish. At my table, a busboy hurriedly dropped a plate, muttering a quick sorry before rushing back to the real guests. I picked up my fork, but before I could take a bite, movement caught my eye. Emily stood up. She didn't make a sound. She didn't slam the table. She simply picked up her plate of risotto in one hand and her glass of expensive Cabernet in the other. Martha was in the middle of a sentence about the importance of pedigree when she noticed Emily moving. "Emily? Where are you going?" "The toast is about to start," Martha demanded. Emily didn't answer. She walked past her father, past her stunned siblings, and crossed the expanse of the private dining room. The room went silent, save for the clatter of silverware from the main restaurant floor. She walked straight to my exile island near the kitchen doors. With a loud scrape that echoed against the glass walls, Emily dragged the heavy spare chair from a nearby serving station and placed it next to mine at the bistro table. It was a tight squeeze. Our knees knocked together, and the table was barely big enough for 2 drinks, let alone 2 dinner plates. "Emily!" Martha stood up now, her face flushing a deep ugly purple. "Get back here this instant. You are making a scene." Emily sat down, arranging her napkin on her lap with deliberate, graceful movements. She took a sip of her wine, then turned to me, her eyes clear and dry. "So, she said, her voice conversational but loud enough to carry to the stunned group 10 feet away. How is the view from here? Better now, I answered, a genuine smile breaking through my mask of calm. Emily! Martha shrieked, losing all pretense of sophistication. This table is for family. You belong over here. Emily turned her head slowly to face her mother. The silence she commanded was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. You're right, Mom, Emily said, her voice steady and lethal. That table is for your family. The one where blood matters more than kindness. The one where humiliation is a sport. She reached out and took my hand, lacing her fingers through mine on the cramped, wobbly table. But this table? This table is for my family. She turned her back on them, effectively building a wall that no amount of guilt-tripping could breach. Now, Emily whispered to me, picking up her fork. Eat your risotto before it gets cold. And then, we're leaving. I looked over her shoulder one last time. Martha was standing there, mouth agape, powerless for the first time in her life. The separation hadn't isolated me. It had freed Emily. The kitchen door swung open again, followed by the clatter of pans, but neither of us flinched. We ate in peace, at the best seat in the house. The crystal chandelier above the center table shimmered, casting a warm, golden glow over the feast that was effectively acting as a barricade between me and the people who were legally my family. My mother-in-law, Patricia, threw her head back in a laugh that was too loud and too sharp, clutching a glass of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Beside her, my brother-in-law, Greg, was gesturing wildly with a lobster claw, recounting some exaggerated story about his latest business venture, while my wife, Sarah, watched them with adoring glassy eyes. They were a portrait of familial bliss, a tight circle of unity that had physically and metaphorically closed ranks against me. I sat 10 feet away. When we had arrived at *Les Jardins*, the hostess had looked confused. The reservation was for 6. There were 7 of us. Patricia had waved her hand dismissively, saying, "Oh, he can just pull up a chair or sit over there," pointing to a small wobbly two-top near the kitchen doors. There was no apology, no attempt to squeeze me in. Just an expectation that I would hover on the periphery like a servant in waiting. So, I took the table. I sat down, smoothed the napkin over my lap, and made a decision that settled in my gut like cold iron. A waiter, looking harried and sympathetic, approached my small exile island. He held his pen ready, his eyes darting toward the raucous main table before settling on me. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice lowered. "Can I start you off with something?" I looked him dead in the eye. "Yes, I would like the roasted chicken and a glass of the house iced tea. But before you put that in, I need to be very clear about something." I leaned in slightly. "I am dining alone. This table is a separate party from that table over there. Under no circumstances is my order to be combined with theirs. I want a separate check." The waiter blinked, then looked over at Patricia, who was currently snapping her fingers to summon a sommelier. A flicker of understanding passed through the waiter's eyes. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood, sir. A separate check. I will ensure it is kept distinct." "Thank you," I said, leaning back. "And please, let them order whatever they want. Don't restrict them on my account." For the next 2 hours, I watched a masterclass in gluttony. Usually when I dined with them, I acted as the unspoken brake on their spending. I would suggest the mid-range wine or remind them that we didn't need 3 appetizers per person. Tonight, with the safety buffer of the wallet sitting silently nearby, they went off the rails. "Let's get the seafood tower," Greg shouted, "the jumbo one." "And another bottle of the 12 Cabernet," Patricia added, not even glancing at the price list. "Actually make it 2 bottles. It's a celebration, isn't it?" I quietly cut into my roasted chicken. It was delicious. Simple, seasoned perfectly, and most importantly, affordable. From my vantage point, I was invisible. Not once did Sarah look over to see if I had water. Not once did Patricia ask if my food was cold. I was a piece of furniture, a utility object expected to function only when the bill arrived. They were devouring Wagyu steaks and truffle-infused risottos, their faces greasy with indulgence. I sipped my iced tea, feeling a strange sense of calm. The anxiety that usually plagued me during these dinners, the mental calculation of the dwindling bank account, was gone. I ordered a slice of cheesecake for dessert. They ordered a flaming baked Alaska and a round of espressos and cognac. The turning point arrived with a subtle clearing of throats. The table fell silent as the plates were cleared. The laughter died down, replaced by the heavy lethargic satisfaction of a meal well conquered. Patricia dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin and looked around, her eyes finally finding me in the corner. She beckoned with a single imperious finger. "Well," she called out, her voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. "That was marvelous. You can come over now." She expected me to walk over, credit card in hand, to collect the damage. Instead, I caught the waiter's eye. He was already moving. He walked past the main table, ignoring Patricia's outstretched hand, and came directly to me. He placed a small, slim black folder on my table. "Your check, sir." "Thank you," I said audibly. I opened it. $45. I placed a $50 bill and a $10 bill inside, a generous tip for his complicity, and stood up. Simultaneously, a second waiter approached the main table. He carried a much larger, thicker leather folder. He placed it gently in the center of the table, right between Patricia and Greg. I buttoned my jacket and began to walk toward the exit. I had to pass their table to leave. As I approached, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to panic. Patricia had opened the folder. "What is this?" she screeched. The sound was like tearing metal. "Waiter, there's been a mistake." She pointed a shaking finger at me as I walked by. "He is paying." I stopped. I didn't approach the table. I stood in the aisle, looking down at them. Sarah looked pale. Greg looked furious. Patricia looked like she was having a stroke. "I'm not paying for that," I said calmly. My voice was steady, lacking the stammering deference they were used to. "Excuse me?" Patricia sputtered, her face turning a violent shade of red. "We are a family, you always pay. That's why you're here." "I was told there was no room at the table," I replied, my voice carrying just enough for the surrounding diners to hear. I sat alone. I ate alone. I ordered chicken and iced tea. "I have paid for my meal." I gestured to the receipt peeking out of the folder on the small table behind me. "I am not paying for 3 pounds of lobster, 2 bottles of vintage Cabernet, and Wagyu steaks that I didn't eat." "Sarah!" Patricia shrieked, turning on her daughter. "Do something. This is humiliating." Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. "Honey, please," she whispered, the first words she had spoken to me all night. "Just put it on the card. We can talk about this later." "Everyone is looking." "They are looking," I agreed. They were looking at a table of 4 adults who just ate $2,000 worth of food without checking if they could afford it. "You selfish little..." Greg started to rise, his face twisting into a snarl. "Sit down, Greg," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Unless you want me to loudly remind everyone about that loan you still haven't paid back from last Christmas? Or perhaps we can discuss why you ordered cognac when you claimed to be broke." Greg froze, hovering halfway out of his chair, then sank back down, defeated. Patricia was vibrating with rage. "I will never forgive this. This is financial abuse. You are abandoning us." "I'm not abandoning you," I said, checking my watch. "I'm leaving a dinner party I wasn't invited to join." "The check is yours, Patricia. You ordered it, you ate it, you enjoyed it. Now you pay for it." I looked at the waiter, who was standing nearby with a neutral expression, though I swore I shallallahu alayhi wasallam the corner of his lip twitch. "Excellent service," I told him. I walked out the front door into the cool night air. Behind me, the muffled sounds of an argument erupted. Patricia's voice rising in shrill desperation as she realized she would have to max out her own credit cards. I didn't look back. For the first time in years, the silence ringing in my ears wasn't loneliness. It was freedom. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away, leaving the astronomical tab and the heavy weight of their expectations firmly in the rearview mirror. The last bite of my filet mignon melted on my tongue, a savory conclusion to a meal that tasted remarkably like freedom. I dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin, deliberately taking my time, savoring not just the lingering notes of the red wine, but the exquisite tension that was beginning to coil in my gut. From my vantage point at the bar, I had a perfect panoramic view of the carnage at the main table. It was a spectacle of gluttony. Empty platters of lobster shells, picked clean T-bones, and half-drunk bottles of vintage champagne littered the white tablecloth like debris from a natural disaster. They were loud, boisterous, and completely oblivious to everything but their own appetites. I watched Martha laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of expensive bubbly in her hand. She looked like a queen holding court, secure in the assumption that her treasury was bottomless because she believed I was footing the bill. It was a presumption she had carried for years, a heavy yoke I was about to shed in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. I caught the eye of the waiter who had been attending to me. He was a sharp young man, observant and professional, who had likely noticed the disparity between my solitary modest dining and the raucous behavior of the group I had arrived with. I signaled him over with a subtle nod. "Everything was excellent," I said quietly, pulling my wallet from my jacket pocket. "I am glad to hear it, sir. Can I get you anything else?" "No, that will be all. I'd like to settle my tab now." I placed my credit card on the polished wood of the bar. "To be clear, I am paying only for what I consumed. My steak, my wine, my water. Nothing else." The waiter hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting briefly toward the loud table in the center of the room, then back to me. A flicker of understanding passed between us. He nodded. "Understood, sir. Just your check." When he returned with the machine, I entered a tip that was more than generous. It was a silent apology for the storm he was about to weather and a bribe for his discretion. I handed back the receipt with a small smile. "Thank you," I whispered. "I'm going to head out now. Please do not disturb them until they ask for the bill." "Of course, sir." "Have a wonderful evening." I slid off the bar stool, adjusting my coat. The air in the restaurant felt suddenly stifling, heavy with the humidity of roasted meats and perfumes. I needed the cool night air. I walked toward the exit, my path taking me within 10 feet of their table. I didn't rush. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who owes nothing to anyone. They didn't even look up. Martha was busy dissecting the dessert menu, arguing with her brother about whether they should order the soufflé or the lava cake. They were so wrapped up in the entitlement of the moment that I was invisible to them. I was merely the wallet, the background noise, the fixture that made their lifestyle possible. I slipped past the hostess stand, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and stepped out to the sidewalk. The street noise was a welcome change, a rush of reality, but I wasn't quite done. I couldn't leave, not yet. I needed to see it. I moved to the side of the restaurant's large front window, hidden by the reflection of the streetlights and the shadows of the evening, and I watched. Inside, the play was reaching its final act. I shallallahu alayhi wasallam the moment the feast concluded. The laughter died down as the heavy lethargy of overeating set in. Martha patted her lips and looked around, her eyes scanning the room. She looked at the bar. I shallallahu alayhi wasallam, her brow furrowed. She scanned the restroom hallway. Then, she turned to the waiter, my ally, and snapped her fingers. Even through the glass, the gesture looked dismissive and rude. I could read her body language perfectly. She was asking where I was. She was gesturing to my empty seat, a look of mild annoyance on her face, likely complaining that I had vanished right when she wanted to leave. She said something sharp, waved her hand dismissively, and then made the universal scribbling motion in the air. Asterisk, the check. Asterisk, she pointed at my empty stool again, clearly instructing him to put it on my tab. Confident that I would return from the restroom any second to sign it, the waiter stood tall. He didn't look toward the restroom. He didn't look toward the door. He looked directly at Martha. He spoke a few words short, precise sentences that caused the color to drain from Martha's face. She froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound seemed to come out. She shook her head violently, laughing nervously, pointing again to where I had been sitting. The waiter remained impassive. He reached into his apron and produced a black leather folder. He didn't slide it onto the table gently. He placed it squarely in front of her with a definitive, heavy motion. Martha stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake. The table had gone quiet. Her brother, her parents, the cousins, they were all looking at her now. The jovial atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. With a trembling hand, Martha flipped the folder open. I imagined the number stamped at the bottom of that long receipt. I had done the mental math while watching them order. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the physical impact of the number hit her. Her eyes widened until they were perfectly round, bulging from her head. She gasped, a visible heaving intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. She dropped the folder onto the table as if it had burned her fingers. No, Sallallahu alayhi wasallam, her mouth formed the word. She looked up at the waiter, screaming now. Her hands were flying in the air, frantic, pointing at the door, pointing at my seat, pointing at the bill. The waiter shook his head calmly. He tapped the bill. The realization washed over the table like a cold wave. Her father grabbed the receipt, put on his reading glasses, and looked at it. He turned pale and slumped back in his chair, dropping the paper. Her brother checked his pockets, pulling out a wallet that looked suspiciously thin. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. They began arguing amongst themselves, fingers pointing, accusations flying. Martha was crying now, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face as she frantically scanned the room, hoping against hope that I would materialize from the shadows to save her. But I was gone. The $2,200 anchor was around her neck, and for the first time in her life, she was going to have to swim or sink on her own. A grim sense of satisfaction settled in my chest, warmer and more fulfilling than the meal I had just finished. I turned my collar up against the wind, turned my back on the window, and began to walk down the street. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of the bill sitting in the center of that table, a black hole swallowing their arrogance, was a memory I would cherish forever. The heavy oak door of the restaurant swung shut behind me, cutting off the ambient jazz and the clatter of silverware. The silence of the parking lot was sweet, but the knowledge of what was unfolding inside was sweeter. I didn't need to be a fly on the wall to know exactly how the scene would play out. I knew these people. I knew their entitlement, their arrogance, and, most importantly, their financial fragility. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching satisfyingly beneath my shoes, and sat in the driver's seat. I didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I placed my phone on the dashboard, screen up, and waited. Inside, the atmosphere must have shifted the moment the waiter approached the table. I could picture Martha, flushed with wine and the heavy satisfaction of a gluttonous meal, probably picking her teeth or waving an empty glass for a refill that would never come. The waiter, a professional young man whose patience had been tested all evening, would have placed the black leather folder on the center of the pristine tablecloth. It wasn't a thin folder. The itemized receipt for 7 people eating Wagyu, lobster, and drinking vintage bottles would have been a long, curling ribbon of judgment. "Oh no, take that away," Martha would have said, waving a dismissive hand, not even looking at him. She likely gestured vaguely toward the empty chair where I had been sitting minutes ago. "The gentleman who just stepped out. He's taking care of everything. Put it on his tab." This was the moment, the pivot point where reality crashed into delusion. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, ma'am," the waiter would have said. His voice would be steady, polite, but unyielding. The gentleman has already settled his bill. Martha's brow would furrow, a crack appearing in her composure. What do you mean? He paid. Then why are you bringing me this? He settled his own bill, ma'am, for the soup and the iced tea. He was quite specific, the waiter would explain, likely taking a small, vindictive pleasure in the delivery. He informed management that he was not associated with your party's expenses and that the table would be handling the remainder of the check individually. I imagine the silence that followed. It would have been absolute. The kind of silence that sucks the air out of the room. Bob, who had been loudly boasting about his new business venture only an hour ago, would have frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth. The cousins, who had ordered the most expensive items on the menu simply because they could, would have exchanged terrified glances. That's ridiculous. Martha's voice would have risen sharp and shrill, turning heads at nearby tables. He's my son. Of course he's paying. He's just ... He's probably in the restroom. Go check the restroom. The gentleman left the building, ma'am. He got in his car. My phone lit up on the dashboard. A text message from Martha. *, where are you? I watched the notification banner fade, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. I could see the panic setting in now. The bill sat on the table like a live grenade. Martha, realizing that shouting at the waiter wasn't working, would have finally snatched up the leather folder. The shock of the number at the bottom would have been physical. It wasn't just a dinner bill. It was a mortgage payment. It was colossal. This ... this is extortion. She would have sputtered, but the bluster was hollow. We didn't order this much. Who ordered the 1998 Cabernet? Accusations would start flying. The united front of the family, previously bonded by their shared leeching of my resources, would crumble instantly. Bob would turn on Sarah for ordering the surf and turf. Martha would scream at the cousins for the rounds of appetizers, but the infighting wouldn't solve the problem. The waiter would still be standing there, looking expectant. And behind him, the floor manager would be taking a step closer, arms crossed, sensing a dine-and-dash situation. We need to pay this. Now, Bob would whisper, the sweat beading on his forehead visible even in my imagination. If they called the cops ... double quotes, the threat of legal trouble was the only thing that could pierce Martha's denial. In our town, image was everything. Being escorted out of the finest steakhouse in handcuffs would destroy her social standing irrevocably. The scramble would begin. I started my car engine, the gentle hum vibrating through the steering wheel. My phone began to ring. It was Bob this time. I let it ring. Back at the table, the humiliation was in full swing. Wallets were being ripped open. Purses were being dumped onto the table. It was a chaotic pooling of resources that was doomed to fall short. I have 200 in cash, one cousin would mutter, throwing crumpled bills onto the linen. Put it in. Martha would hiss. She would be digging for her credit cards, the ones she usually kept for emergencies or appearances, the ones that were likely already hovering near their limits. Try this one, she would tell the waiter, handing over a card with a trembling hand. The waiter would walk away, leaving them in agonizing suspense. Minutes would feel like hours. When he returned, the shake of his head would be a hammer blow. Decline, ma'am. Try it again. It must be the machine. It was declined, ma'am. Do you have another form of payment? My phone buzzed again. 7 missed calls. A string of texts. * pick up the phone. You can't do this. We don't have enough. They're threatening to call the police. Stop joking around and come back. * I pulled out of the parking spot, easing the car onto the main road. The streetlights flickered past in a rhythmic blur. I could visualize the finale of their evening. They would be forced to max out every card they had. Bob would have to use the company credit card he wasn't supposed to touch for personal expenses. Sarah would be draining her savings account via a debit transfer. They would be scraping together every cent, emptying their pockets of loose change, stripping themselves of dignity to avoid the flashing lights of a squad car. The financial blow would be severe, but the psychological one was devastating. For years, they had viewed me not as a person, but as a wallet and infinite resource that required no maintenance, only extraction. Tonight, the tap had run dry. They were being forced to pay the market price for their own greed, and the cost was higher than they could bear. The phone rang again. Martha. I glanced at the screen, seeing her name flashing urgently. I could hear her voice in my head without even answering, the mix of rage, fear, and disbelief. She wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling to demand I fix the mess she had made, to scream at me for breaking the unwritten contract of my servitude. I reached over and pressed the decline button. The silence in the car returned, peaceful and profound. I wasn't just driving home. I was driving away from a lifetime of obligation. As the distance between the restaurant and me grew, I felt lighter. They would figure it out, or they wouldn't. They would pay the bill, or they would face the consequences. For the first time in my life, the outcome of their actions belonged entirely to them. I turned on the radio, finding a station playing soft, upbeat jazz, the same genre that had been playing in the restaurant. Only this time I could actually enjoy it. The night was young, the road was open, and my bank account remained exactly as it had been an hour ago, untouched. The waiter approached the main table with that practiced, invisible grace of fine dining staff, holding the leather folio that contained the night's reckoning. I watched him from my vantage point, a small, wobbly two-top squeezed near the kitchen swing doors, a good 20 feet away from where the rest of the family sat laughing under the warm glow of the chandelier. For the past 2 hours, I had watched my wife, Emily, and her parents, siblings, and cousins enjoy the family reunion dinner. I had been explicitly told there simply wasn't enough room at the main table for everyone, and since I was an in-law and not blood, surely I wouldn't mind sitting apart. I didn't mind. In fact, I had spent the meal savoring the silence, preparing for exactly this moment. As the waiter hovered, unsure of who the patriarch was, Emily's father, Robert, didn't even look up from his brandy. He simply waved a dismissive hand over his shoulder, pointing a thick finger directly at me across the room. "The gentleman over there has it," Robert announced, his voice booming with the jovial arrogance of a man who had unreached for his wallet in half a decade. "He takes care of the family." The waiter turned, pivoting on his heel to walk toward me. The room seemed to go quiet. The clinking of silverware stopped at their table as they waited for the ritual to complete, the part where I, the outsider, bought my way back into their good graces for another month. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide, a flicker of nervous anticipation tightening her jaw. She knew I was upset about the seating arrangement, but she assumed the routine would hold. I didn't move to take the folder. I didn't reach for my back pocket. I just sat there, my hands folded on the table, staring calmly at the waiter. "Sir?" the waiter asked, extending the black book toward me. "Oh, there must be a mistake," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to bridge the gap between the exile table and the family table. "I'm on a separate check. I already paid mine." The silence that fell over the main table was instant and absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. Robert turned in his chair, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. Emily's mother, Linda, gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace as if physically struck. "Excuse me?" Robert sputtered, twisting his body around to face me fully. "What is this?" "Stop playing games and pay the man." I stood up then, taking my time to button my jacket. I walked the 20 feet slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the restaurant shifting toward the drama. When I arrived at their table, I didn't sit. I stood over them, looking down at the scattered remnants of the lobster thermidor and vintage wine bottles. They had ordered without a second thought for the price. "I'm not playing a game, Robert," I said, my tone ice cold. "I paid for my meal. The one I ate alone, by the kitchen." "This is ridiculous," Linda hissed, leaning in, her eyes darting around to see who was watching. "You always pay. It's your contribution. Don't cause a scene." "A contribution implies I'm part of the group," I replied. "But tonight, you made a very specific point of distinguishing who is family and who isn't. You drew a line in the sand with the seating chart. I'm just respecting that line. Emily! Robert barked, turning to his daughter. Talk some sense into your husband. Emily looked up at me, her face pale. She looked at her parents, then back at me. For years, she had played the peacekeeper, smoothing over their insults, begging me to be the bigger man, to buy their affection so her life would be easier. But tonight, she shallallahu lillahi wasallam the humiliation I had endured sitting by the kitchen doors. She shallallahu alayhi wasallam the exhaustion in my eyes. She stayed silent, looking down at her empty dessert plate. She has nothing to do with this, I said to Robert. This is between you and the bill. Since I'm not family enough to sit at this table, I'm certainly not family enough to subsidize it. I turned to the waiter, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. These folks are ready to settle up, separately. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked toward the exit. The sound behind me was chaotic, the rustle of panic. I heard Robert swearing under his breath, the aggressive unzip of a purse, and the frantic, hushed arguments about who had brought which credit card and whether they were maxed out. They had ordered with the appetite of kings, banking on a treasury that had just closed its doors. I waited in the car. It took them another 20 minutes to emerge. When they finally came out, they looked defeated. Robert walked with a slump, stripped of his earlier bravado. Linda looked furious, clutching her purse as if it had been violated. They didn't even look at my car as they marched to their own vehicles. When Emily finally slid into the passenger seat, the atmosphere in the car was heavy, charged with the static of the unsaid. She closed the door, and we sat in the dark parking lot for a long moment. I started the engine, the low hum vibrating through the tense silence. My dad had to call the bank to authorize a transfer, Emily said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Mom was crying in the bathroom. They were humiliated. I turned to the waiter, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. These folks are ready to settle up, separately. Did you have to do it like that? She asked, though there was no accusation in her tone, only a wary curiosity. In front of everyone? They did it in front of everyone, Em, I countered gently. They put me at the kids' table in a 5-star restaurant. They made sure everyone knew my place. I just confirmed it. She sighed, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. We drove for miles without speaking, the city blurring past us. The dynamic had shifted. The tectonic plates of our marriage and her family relations had ground together and caused a massive quake, and now we were surveying the new landscape. Later that night, back in the safety of our living room, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a stark clarity. I poured 2 glasses of water and sat down opposite her. She looked tired, caught in the middle of a war she hadn't started but had failed to stop. I leaned forward, clasping my hands. I need you to understand something, Emily. I love you. I would do anything for you. But tonight wasn't about money, it was about respect. She nodded slowly. I know, it's just, they're going to cut us off. They said as much in the parking lot. Let them, I said. Because I meant what I said back there. If I wasn't considered family enough to sit at their table, I certainly wasn't family enough to pay for their dinner. The sentence hung in the air, absolute and final. It was the new law of our land. Emily looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all night. She shallallahu alayhi wasallam the line I had drawn, and she realized that by crossing it, her parents had left her on my side. The financial safety net I provided had been the only thing masking their disdain, the only thing keeping the peace. Without it, there was nothing left but the naked truth of their behavior. They faced the consequences, I continued, my voice soft. For the first time they had to pay for their own choices. Literally. Emily took a sip of water, then set the glass down with a decisive click. You're right, she whispered. I should have stood up for you regarding the seats. I shouldn't have let you sit there alone. It's done, I said. But going forward the dynamic changes. We aren't buying their approval anymore. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was firm. Okay, she said. Okay. It was a hard-earned lesson, expensive in its emotional toll. But as the lights went out in the house that night, the peace I felt was worth every penny I hadn't spent. The ambiguity was gone. We were no longer paying customers in the drama of her family. We were free agents, and for the first time in years, the check was balanced.